Welcome to the debate. What if the most famous rule in modern retirement planning was never actually designed to keep you safe?
Right, like it was meant for something else entirely.
Exactly. What if it was instead repackaged by the wealth management industry to keep you working, a decade longer than you mathematically need to? Today, we are examining the fundamental tension in wealth accumulation.
Yeah, the stark divergence between the actual physics of compounding money and the highly conservative narrative sold by the financial industry.
Precisely. Specifically, we're scrutinizing the validity of two widely accepted milestones, the $100,000 accumulation target and the 4% safe withdrawal rule. I will argue that the financial industry has basically weaponized worst-case scenarios and outdated metrics to keep individuals oversaving and, frankly, overpaying in management fees.
Which masks the true thresholds of financial independence.
It deliberately masks them, yes.
Well, I will argue that while the raw, sterile mathematics of earlier retirement are technically accurate in a vacuum, the traditional, more conservative benchmarks are actually entirely justified.
You think they're necessary?
I do. I believe they serve as a necessary structural and psychological buffer against catastrophic human behavioral errors, suboptimal tax planning, and highly unpredictable market sequences.
Well, let's lay our cards on the table regarding these industry milestones, starting with the accumulation phase.
Sure.
For decades, the financial sector has relied on Charlie Munger's famous 1994 adage that the first $100,000 is a bitch.
A classic quote.
It is. And they treat it as the ultimate psychological and mathematical milestone for compounding. But if we adjust for 2026 purchasing power and look at the actual physics of compound growth, that true escape velocity threshold—
The point where the math takes over.
Right, where it takes over the heavy lifting. That threshold is actually $250,000. And on the withdrawal side, William Benjamin's 1994 4% rule was explicitly engineered as a mathematical floor.
Meaning the worst-case scenario.
Exactly. It was calibrated for a hypothetical person retiring in 1968, facing the single most destructive sequence of returns and stagflation in a 140-year historical data set. Yet, the wealth management industry took that absolute worst-case floor and deceptively rebranded it as a ceiling.
As the absolute maximum safe rate.
Right, establishing it as a ceiling to maximize their fee extraction.
I come at it from a different way. Financial planning simply cannot assume a frictionless, perfectly disciplined human being making purely rational choices.
Well, sure, people make mistakes.
More than mistakes. We are dealing with biological creatures who panic, not algorithms that execute flawlessly. The math might very well demonstrate that a 6% withdrawal rate is historically sustainable on average, but a retiree doesn't live an average of 115 rolling 30-year market cycles.
They live just one.
Exactly one. They experience their single unique sequence of returns. Therefore, calibrating for that 1968 worst-case scenario is not some fee-driven conspiracy designed to extract wealth.
You don't think fees play a role?
I think it is a vital, non-negotiable margin of safety for a system where the penalty for failure is, running out of capital in your 80s.
Let's dig into the actual mechanics of that accumulation phase, because the core misunderstanding driving people to overwork is how money actually behaves at different stages of critical mass.
Okay, let's break that down.
Below that $250,000 threshold, the investor is the primary engine of wealth creation. Think of a rocket trying to break orbit.
Fighting gravity.
Right. The first few thousand feet require maximum thrust just to fight the immediate gravity. If an individual is investing, say, $12,000 a year, aiming for an average 7% market return, it takes roughly 7 years to reach that first $100,000.
It's a massive grind.
It is. Because if you look at the ledger, about 80% of that $100,000 is pure brute force contribution from their paycheck. The investor is burning their own fuel. Compound interest is merely a backup dancer at that point.
The mathematics of those early years are undisputed. I mean, the effort to reward ratio is incredibly skewed against the investor early on, which is precisely why people abandon their savings plans.
Exactly. It feels like a treadmill, but the physics inevitably flip. As you push past $100,000, the market starts generating roughly 40% of the growth. But when you cross $250,000, you hit true escape velocity.
The tipping point.
Yes. For the first time in the investor's life, the average market returns are contributing more raw dollars to the portfolio's growth than the investor's own savings. The market becomes the primary engine.
Right.
To understand how powerful this is, we have to look at the mechanics of the rule of 72. If you divide the number 72 by your expected annual rate of return, let's use 7%, it tells you that your money will double roughly every 10 years, entirely on its own.
Assuming the returns are consistent, yeah.
Right. So take a hypothetical construction supervisor named Marcus. He makes $75,000 a year, and he currently has $230,000 saved after 16 years of packing his lunches and skipping vacations.
He's exhausted.
He is exhausted and frustrated because $230,000 doesn't feel anywhere close to financial independence. But what nobody is telling Marcus is that he is a mere $20,000 away from the threshold where his money works harder than he does.
The $250K mark?
Yes. At $250,000, even if Marcus never contributes another dime of his own labor, the math dictates his portfolio doubles to $500,000 in 10 years and to $1 million in 20. The industry keeps Marcus grinding, totally blind to his own momentum.
Look, I understand the elegance of the rule of 72, but projecting a passive, uninterrupted doubling over 20 years ignores the severe psychological danger embedded right at that $250,000 threshold.
Danger? How so?
You're assuming Marcus is a machine who'll sit back and passively watch his balance double over a decade of volatile market cycles. We have to look at how humans actually behave when real money evaporates.
Okay.
Look at the Vanguard behavioral data from the 2022 market decline, where the S&P 500 dropped approximately 18%. When an investor has $20,000, an 18% market correction is a rounding error. It doesn't induce panic.
Sure, it's just a few $1,000.
But at $250,000, a sudden 10 or 15% correction translates to a $25,000 to $37,000 paper loss. To a guy making $75,000 a year, that is not a paper loss. That is a new truck. That is a year of his child's college tuition vanishing in 3 weeks.
But it is mechanically just a paper loss. The underlying shares haven't vanished, only their momentary valuation has. The market recovers.
The market recovers, yes, but the investor's portfolio often does not, because the human brain interprets that specific size of loss as a literal threat to survival. That $25,000 drop triggers severe emotional panic.
So they sell.
Exactly. The Vanguard data clearly demonstrates that investors who made emotionally driven trades during that 2022 drawdown locked in realized losses nearly twice as severe as those who simply held their positions.
Wow, twice as severe.
Yes. They abandoned their strategy, sold low into the decline out of sheer terror, and then bought back in only after the market had already recovered. This so-called escape velocity is the precise threshold where the temptation to make a catastrophically expensive mistake is at its absolute sharpest.
Because the balance is bigger.
Right. The balance is suddenly large enough to trigger legitimate terror, but not yet large enough to mathematically absorb a major behavioral error.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are suggesting we should actively withhold mathematical reality to protect people from their own psychology.
Not withhold, just buffer.
But treating a $250,000 portfolio as a threshold too dangerous to properly explain is like refusing to tell a pilot they've reached cruising altitude simply because turbulence exists.
But turbulence will cause a pilot to crash the plane if they panic and overcorrect the controls.
Which is precisely why we put them in simulators and train them on the mechanics. There is a brilliant concept from aviation instrument flight training called spatial disorientation.
Okay, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, when a pilot flies inside a heavy cloud bank with zero visibility, the fluid in their inner ear will literally lie to their brain. The physical sensation will tell them that they are climbing when the aircraft is actually in a steep dive.
So they have to trust the instruments.
Yes. The training isn't just to look at the altimeter. The training is to actively override your own biological instincts. You must distrust your gut because your gut will feel absolutely fundamentally correct at the exact moment it is driving you into the ground.
Right.
We have to teach investors the actual mathematics, the instruments, before they enter the clouds of a 20% market correction. You wire the mechanical expectation of volatility into their decision-making in advance. You don't keep them ignorant, treating them like children who can't handle the physics of their own wealth.
Education is a noble goal in a classroom, but that theoretical discipline evaporates the moment real money is on the line. And that biological panic you were describing at $250,000 doesn't just vanish when an investor reaches the end of their career.
Well, no, of course not.
In fact, it multiplies significantly because they no longer have a paycheck to replace the losses. Which brings us to the ultimate point of contention, the $800,000 finish line and the debate over the 4% withdrawal rule.
I am very glad we are moving here because this is where the industry's narrative is most egregiously self-serving. We are constantly told by financial media that a secure retirement requires $1 million or $1.2 million or even $1.5 million to safely execute a 4% withdrawal rate.
It's the standard advice.
It is. But if we look at Michael Kitz's rigorous stress testing of those exact same 115 rolling 30-year retirement periods going back to the 1870s, the exact same data William Bengen used to create the 4% rule, the results are staggering.
Staggering how?
Well, at a 4% withdrawal rate, exactly 0 of those portfolios were depleted over 30 years. Not one single scenario failed.
None.
0. Furthermore, in over 50% of all historical scenarios, retirees strictly following that 4% rule didn't just survive. They died with more than double their starting balance. They retired with $800,000 and passed away with over $1.6 million.
Because that 4% rule was engineered to survive the sequence of returns risk of the late 1960s.
Exactly. It is an absolute floor. Let's explain sequence of returns risk for a moment. It's the order in which you experience market returns. If you retire in a year like 1968 and the market drops while inflation spikes and you are actively pulling cash out of a shrinking portfolio to buy groceries, those dollars are permanently removed.
They can't recover.
Right. It cannot capture the eventual market recovery. Bengen calibrated the 4% rule specifically to survive that exact brutal combination of high inflation and early market contraction. But Kitz's analysis proves that the historical average sustainable withdrawal rate across normal market conditions is actually 6%.
A 6% withdrawal rate.
Yes. Think about the mechanics of applying a 6% rate to an $800,000 portfolio. That generates $48,000 a year in portfolio income. Add the current average combined household Social Security benefit of roughly $45,600, and you are generating $93,600 in annual income.
Okay.
For the vast majority of middle-class earners, $93,600 entirely replaces their peak working income, and they can hit that checkpoint at just $800,000. But if a wealth manager confirms that math, the argument for grinding another 5 years and paying 5 more years of management fees on a massive 7-figure balance completely evaporates.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go for it.
You are presenting the 6% withdrawal rate as a neat, clean mathematical certainty. But you are completely ignoring the massive structural fragility of how ordinary people hold their assets.
Fragility in what sense?
The $800,000 model generating $48,000 a year requires a highly optimized, low-cost, equity-weighted portfolio held perfectly through decades of market cycles. More importantly, it requires flawless tax architecture.
Okay, tax architecture is important, yes.
It's vital. Most people simply do not have that. Let's look at the mechanical default reality for an American worker. Most people have their entire $800,000 sitting in a default traditional 401k because that is what their human resources department set up when they were hired.
True.
Because that money went in pre-tax. Every single dollar they pull out in retirement is taxed as ordinary income.
Which is a known variable.
A variable that causes massive compounding damage. If a retiree is in the 12% marginal federal tax bracket, plus state taxes, every $100,000 they withdraw costs them well over $12,000 to $15,000 right off the top.
It's a significant chunk.
Yes. Over a 20 or 30-year retirement, that tax drag is not a minor friction. It compounds into a multi-six-figure loss of lifetime income. Because the average person lacks a perfectly balanced architecture between post-tax Roth accounts and pre-tax traditional accounts, they do not have the legal flexibility to manipulate their tax brackets in retirement.
Right, they can't pivot.
Exactly. They can't pull from a tax-free Roth when they're about to cross into a higher bracket. Therefore, the conservative $1 million plus target and the 4% withdrawal rate isn't some malicious fee-harvesting conspiracy. It is a pragmatic, necessary buffer designed to absorb the friction of real-world taxes, management fees, and the suboptimal account structures that the average investor operates within.
But that logic proves my exact point. The solution to a structural tax inefficiency should never be sacrifice 5 more years of your life to oversave.
So what is the solution then?
The solution should be fix the underlying structure. Let's look at a practical application of optimal tax architecture. Take a 42-year-old named Sandra. She makes $110,000 a year and currently has a balance of $180,000.
Like Marcus from earlier.
Exactly. Like Marcus, she feels hopelessly far from the finish line, but if she simply contributes $14,000 annually at our standard 7% return, she mathematically crosses that $250,000 escape velocity threshold in under 4 years.
Okay.
From there, the physics of compounding take the wheel. She hits $800,000 by age 56.
But she still faces the tax drag when she attempts to draw on it at 56.
Not if she understands the mechanics of Roth conversions. During her accumulation phase, rather than just dumping everything into a pre-tax 401k, Sandra purposefully shifts a portion of her contributions into a Roth IRA, paying the taxes up front while her income is relatively moderate.
Building the post-tax ladder.
Right, she builds a ladder of post-tax money, so when she retires at 56, she can blend her withdrawals, taking just enough from her traditional accounts to fill up the lowest tax brackets and pulling the rest tax-free from her Roth.
Keeping her effective tax rate low.
Exceptionally low. Hitting $800,000 and achieving this optimized tax architecture by age 56 is entirely mathematically viable for a middle-class earner. The tragedy here is that the financial industry would heavily prefer to sell Sandra a 1% active management fee to manage her bloated pre-tax accounts, rather than teach her how to execute targeted Roth conversions to permanently eliminate her tax drag.
That assumes a level of robotic precision that simply does not exist in human behavior.
It's just planning.
But if Sandra executes her Roth conversion ladder flawlessly, balances her equities perfectly, and never panics during a recession, yes, she retires at 56. But you're describing a highly educated exception, not the rule.
She doesn't have to be the exception.
The industry has to design advice for the median outcome, and the median outcome involves individuals who panic during corrections, people who pay average mutual fund fees because they don't know what an index fund is, and people who have 100% of their net worth trapped in pre-tax buckets.
But by deliberately planning for the worst-case human behavior, the industry is creating a devastating human cost. We are systematically demanding that people trade the single most finite non-renewable resource they possess, their time, for a statistical cushion they will almost certainly never tap into.
Let's examine that human cost directly then.
We must, because the mathematics of overaccumulation are heartbreaking in practice. Consider the trajectory of a man named David.
Okay, who's David?
David is the ultimate cautionary tale of the industry's moving goalposts. Through disciplined saving, David hit the actual mathematical finish line of $800,000 at age 54.
So he was theoretically ready.
The math completely cleared him. At a 5% withdrawal rate plus his expected Social Security, he was on track to safely generate about $85,000 a year, which was roughly 95% of his $90,000 working income.
That's a great spot to be in.
It is, but the fear the financial media instilled in him kept him at his desk. He told himself he'd finally be secure at $1 million.
Which is a common psychological barrier.
Very common. Then he hit $1.2 million and pushed the target to $1.4 million because of vague anxieties about inflation and medical costs.
Right.
By the time he finally pulled the plug at age 62 with $1.4 million, his portfolio was generating so much cash that he was replacing a staggering 134% of his working income.
Which provides an immense safety net.
but it is a mathematical absurdity. Let's break down why replacing 134% of your income is entirely unnecessary. During your working years, a massive portion of your gross income never actually reaches your lifestyle.
True, a lot goes to savings and taxes.
Exactly. You are paying 7.65% in FICA payroll taxes. You are shoveling 10% to 15% into a 401k. You are often paying a mortgage. In retirement, the FICA tax disappear. The retirement contributions stop. The mortgage is usually paid off.
So expenses naturally drop.
Mechanically, most retirees only need about 70% of their gross working income to maintain the exact same standard of living. By forcing his portfolio to replace 134%, David wasn't buying security, he was hoarding excess capacity. And here is the tragedy. Right after he retired at 62, his wife received a severe terminal health diagnosis.
Oh man, that is undeniably a tragic sequence of events.
It is tragic precisely because it was entirely avoidable. David did not lack money. He lacked an honest mathematical framework. Nobody pulled him aside at 54 and said, "You are clear to go, live your life."
No one gave him the green light.
Instead, his portfolio manager quietly collected 4 more years of percentage-based fees on a rapidly compounding 7-figure balance. His employer got to keep a highly reliable project manager for 4 extra years.
Wow.
And David literally traded his wife's remaining healthy years they had explicitly planned to spend traveling and skiing, for a redundant mathematical surplus that ended up being used to schedule his retirement around oncology appointments. The industry's conservative guardrails literally robbed him of his time.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered how people actually behave when they lack that surplus?
I think the math protects them.
I empathize deeply with David's situation. I really do. But I want to bring in a major study from the Employee Benefit Research Institute, which tracks actual, real-world retirement spending over time.
Okay, what does it show?
Their data reveals a fascinating paradox. Nearly half of all retirees significantly underspend their stated financial plans in the first several years of retirement. Their portfolios actually continue to grow because they are so incredibly hesitant to withdraw the money they saved.
Well, they underspend because they have been aggressively trained by the industry to be terrified of going broke.
Perhaps the industry played a role, sure. But the fear of running out of money functions as a permanent, deeply ingrained behavioral anchor. You argue that pushing for a $1.2 million or $1.4 million balance is strictly about generating advisor fees.
It heavily factors in.
I argue that the surplus buys the psychological permission to actually spend the money. Without that massive, undeniably redundant surplus, without knowing deep in their bones that they are miles away from the cliff edge, retirees like David would likely be too paralyzed by anxiety to take those ski trips in the first place.
You think they just wouldn't spend it?
Exactly. The conservative $1.4 million target isn't just a fee-harvesting tool. It is the steep price of psychological peace of mind. They built the escape velocity, but without the comfort of the surplus, they never actually permit themselves to use it.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. What you are effectively acknowledging is that the financial industry has actively fostered a psychological disease, chronic financial anxiety, and is now aggressively selling the cure.
I wouldn't call it a disease.
But that cure involves working an extra decade in a cubicle to build a completely redundant statistical cushion. Curing financial anxiety by overworking is a catastrophic trade-off. We are talking about time. Time is finite, and it is entirely non-negotiable.
I agree that time is finite.
Once you cross that $800,000 threshold with a sound tax strategy, you are statistically, historically, and mathematically secure. The primary danger at that altitude isn't the gravity of the market. The danger is firing the thrusters in the wrong direction through emotional panic.
But preventing that emotional panic is exactly what the massive surplus accomplishes. Let's look at the mechanics of a drawdown.
All right.
If you have a lean $800,000 and the market drops 20%, your balance plummets to $640,000. For a person who absolutely requires $48,000 a year from that portfolio to survive, their actual withdrawal rate just mathematically spiked from 6% to 7.5%.
Yes, mathematically.
The panic sets in immediately because they are chewing through the principal. Conversely, if they have a $1.4 million surplus and take the exact same 20% hit, they still have over $1.1 million remaining. The required $48,000 withdrawal remains safely below a 4.5% rate. The sheer size of the surplus prevents the exact behavioral panic that causes the errors that ruin the math.
But they only panic if they don't understand the underlying mechanics of what is happening. And this brings us full circle to where we began. The true checkpoints of wealth creation, $250,000 to establish accumulation momentum, and $800,000 to achieve total income replacement, are deliberately obscured from the public.
Obscured is a strong word.
They are obscured by an industry that is structurally incentivized to harvest fees by perpetuating fear. If an investor truly understands that the 4% withdrawal rate was built on the stagflation of 1968, and they understand the mechanics of Roth conversions required to optimize their drawdowns, they do not need to sacrifice a decade of their life for a $1.4 million cushion. They just need baseline discipline.
And my summary position is simply this. While the raw mechanics of Kitz's historical scenarios and the math of escape velocity are undeniably compelling in theory, human beings are incredibly fallible creatures.
We are human, yes.
We panic during recessions. We routinely fail to optimize our tax structures. We face unpredictable, real-world frictions like sudden medical expenses or forced early retirements. The traditional, highly conservative guardrails, the $1.2 million targets and the strict 4% rules, are highly functional and necessary, even if they are mathematically redundant. They provide the required margin of error to absorb the messy reality of human lives.
I think where we fundamentally converge today is that the absolute most crucial step for any individual is taking the time to understand the underlying physics of their own money. You simply cannot afford to blindly trust default industry settings.
Absolutely, I fully agree. The default settings in financial services are almost universally designed to maximize employer administrative convenience and government tax revenue, not to facilitate your early retirement.
Precisely, especially when we examine the mechanics of fee drag. If an investor accepts a standard 1% annual management fee on a $300,000 portfolio and lets it compound over 30 years, that fee doesn't just cost them 1% a year.
It eats into the growth.
Because it reduces the compounding base annually, it fundamentally erodes the exponential growth. That 1% fee ultimately costs approximately $170,000 in foregone wealth.
That is a staggering number.
It's nearly a decade of retirement income handed over to a fund manager who, statistically speaking, will underperform a basic index fund anyway. We both agree that mastering these mechanics is the only reliable way out of the maze.
We do. The tension between optimizing a portfolio for absolute mathematical efficiency and building in a robust layer of psychological safety remains a deeply personal balance.
Exactly. At the end of the day, there is no clean, perfect diagnostic X-ray for financial independence. The listener must examine their own balance, calculate their own required escape velocity, and decide for themselves. Are you willing to overpay with the precious, utterly finite time of your life to buy a statistical cushion you may never actually need?